This face looks familiar. It hangs in churches, it stares down from museum ceilings, it appears on posters and in Sunday school textbooks. A pale, often blue-eyed Jesus with flowing hair and classical features. But is that the man who walked the hills of Galilee? What if everything we think we know about Jesus' face comes more from Renaissance studios and colonial classrooms than from the historical record? Today we will examine scripture, art history, archaeology, and the theological life of communities to answer a clear question. Was Jesus really a black man? We'll weigh what the evidence makes likely, what remains uncertain, and why this question matters for faith and justice. If you're curious about uncovering historical truth behind familiar images, hit subscribe. Start with the image most of the Western world inherited. During the Renaissance, artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci recast biblical scenes through the lens of classical idealism and contemporary European beauty. Christ became cast as a heroic Greco-Roman figure, long hair, aquiline nose, light skin, an idealized human body modeled on statues and patrons rather than on the people of first-century Palestine. These images were not neutral copies of an older tradition. They were creative acts shaped by the aesthetics, theology, and power structures of their makers. When European empires expanded from the 16th century onward, missionaries, colonial education, and printed Bibles carried these paintings and sculptures around the globe. Over centuries, the European face of Jesus became the global default, not because it reflected reliable historical knowledge, but because it fit the visual vocabulary and authority of those who taught and ruled. That matters because images are not merely decorative. Depicting Christ in European features reinforced a cultural norm. The sacred and the superior were to be imagined in European terms. This visual language dovetailed with political and economic systems that justified hierarchy and domination. So before we get to bones and texts, we have to acknowledge that iconography has politics: who makes the image, who propagates it, and who gains from its acceptance. Next, what does the Bible itself say about Jesus' physical appearance? The short answer is almost nothing concrete. The Gospels give no physical portrait. They describe actions, teachings, relationships, miracles, and ultimately a crucifixion and resurrection. But they are curiously silent about hair color, eye color, or exact complexion. That silence leaves a vacuum into which centuries of artists, cultures, and ideologies poured their own presuppositions. Two Old and New Testament passages are often brought into this conversation and deserve careful attention. Isaiah 53, the famous suffering servant poem, includes lines that early Christians read as prophetic of Jesus.
In Isaiah 53, 2-3, the servant is described in terms that deny conventional attractiveness. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. Read as poetry, that passage communicates the servant's lowly and unexpected status. It says little about specific ethnic features. It does not provide a physical profile that settles questions of skin tone. Revelation 1:14-15 offers vivid symbolic imagery. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire, and his feet were like burnished bronze. But Revelation is apocalyptic literature, a genre that speaks in metaphor and cosmic images. Descriptions like hair like wool function on a symbolic register and are not straightforward ethnographic notes. Scholars caution against reading these lines as a literal portrait. In short, the Bible's textual evidence is suggestive in places, but it does not deliver a photo. If the texts are mostly silent, the next place to look is geography and demography. Jesus was born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, towns in the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean region that today includes Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and parts of Syria. That region has been a crossroads of peoples for millennia. Semitic-speaking populations, Mediterranean traders, Africans from Egypt and beyond, and Romans of varied ancestries all intersected there. A sensible starting point, then, is the typical appearance of an adult Jewish man from Galilee in the 1st century. Population studies and the surviving archaeological record suggest that 1st-century Jewish men from the Levant most likely had olive to darker olive skin tones, dark hair, and other Mediterranean or West Asian features. They were not Northern Europeans. Hair was typically shorter and coarser than the flowing locks that appear in much religious art. Clothing and grooming patterns also differ from artistic conventions. Beards were common, but hairstyles varied. In other words, the historical Jesus was almost certainly a Middle Eastern Jew in appearance, closer in look to contemporary Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, and other Levantine peoples than to the idealized Europeans of Renaissance painting. Forensic science has tried to make this more concrete. In the early 2000s, forensic anthropologists and facial reconstruction specialists produced reconstructions based on cranial data from first-century remains in the region. One high-profile reconstruction created for a documentary project used statistics about skull shape, population-level traits, and typical soft tissue depth to produce a portrait of a Galilean man. The result? A shorter, broader face, darker complexion, and hair and beard consistent with Semitic features, a very different look from the familiar Renaissance Christ. It is important, however, to stress the limits of forensic reconstructions. They represent plausible averages, not photographic certainty.
A skull gives clues about bone structure, but skin tone, hair color, eye color, and many other traits are not fixed in bone. Reconstructions rely on statistical norms and educated inference. They are valuable because they challenge assumptions and offer alternative visualizations grounded in regional data, but they are not definitive portraits. We should say likely or plausible, not proven, when we describe their results. The story becomes richer and more complicated when we trace the African connections present in the biblical and early Christian world. Matthew 2 recounts that Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus fled to Egypt to escape Herod's violence. That brief narrative shows that the Holy Family spent time within an African environment, however temporarily. Other New Testament episodes point to African individuals and communities. Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross, is described as coming from Cyrene, a North African Jewish community. Acts 8 tells of an Ethiopian eunuch, a high court official, who receives baptism and becomes a prominent figure in the early spread of Christianity. Beyond the texts, Christianity quickly took root in parts of Africa. By late antiquity, Christian communities in Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia developed their own liturgies, theological voices, and visual traditions. Those African Christian traditions have an iconographic history that contrasts with European imagery. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for example, has long portrayed Christ with darker skin and with local features that resonate with Ethiopian believers. Nubian churches contain frescoes and carvings showing Christ and saints in ways that align with African aesthetics and identities. These are not modern inventions. They reflect continuous local theological expression. Moreover, influential theologians and church fathers came from the African world, Augustine of Hippo being a prominent example, reminding us that early Christianity was multi-geographic and multi-ethnic. The modern movement that emphasizes a black Jesus takes both historical and pastoral forms. For enslaved Africans and descendants of enslaved people in the Americas, the image of a black Christ served and serves as an instrument of survival, dignity, and resistance. Theologians like James Cone articulated a black liberation theology that reinterprets Jesus as identifying with the oppressed. In that theological frame, depicting Jesus with black or darker skin is not just iconography, it is a claim about solidarity and God's presence with suffering communities. That pastoral function is legitimate and powerful, even if it functions partly as corrective to centuries of cultural exclusion. We must be careful, though, about categories. Modern racial labels like black and white carry histories and meanings formed in contexts such as the transatlantic slave trade and modern European imperialism. Applying those categories bluntly to a first-century Levantine man is anachronistic. The population of the ancient Near East included dark-skinned Africans, light-skinned peoples of Anatolia, Mediterranean peoples, and many gradations in between. So when someone asks, was Jesus a black man? We should clarify whether they mean, could Jesus have had dark skin consistent with African or Afroasiatic populations? Or whether they mean, was Jesus black in the modern racial sense? The former is historically plausible. The latter mixes modern identity categories with an ancient context in ways that can mislead. Let's synthesize the evidence. Artistic tradition, largely European from the Renaissance onward, and therefore not reliable as evidence of Jesus' historical appearance. Biblical texts, remarkably silent on descriptive physical detail. Isaiah 53 and Revelation 1 contain poetic and symbolic language that resists literal reading as an anthropological portrait. Geography and demographics, strong grounds for picturing Jesus as a Middle Eastern Jew, olive to darker olive complexion, dark hair, Semitic features. Forensic reconstructions, supportive of a Galilean Semite appearance, but probabilistic, not definitive. African presence in the biblical world and early Christianity, demonstrable and significant, with local Christian traditions that legitimately portray Christ in darker hues. So how to answer the title question directly? Was Jesus really a black man? The most balanced conclusion is this: Jesus was almost certainly a first-century Jewish man from the Levant, whose appearance would have been consistent with the regional population, most plausibly an olive to darker complexion with Semitic features. Calling him black in the sense used in modern racial discourse is imprecise and anachronistic, yet representing Jesus as non-European, including depictions that identify him with darker-skinned communities, is both historically defensible in a broad Afro-Asiatic and Mediterranean context and theologically meaningful for communities that have found in that image dignity and liberation. This is not merely a debate about pigments and portraits. Images of Christ shape how believers imagine God's proximity to the marginalized. When the dominant image of Jesus is European, people who are not European can suffer a subtle, demoralizing message that holiness and power look like someone else. Conversely, when oppressed communities depict Jesus in their likeness, they claim theological standing and spiritual kinship. They are not merely changing a picture, they are declaring that God is present with them. That pastoral truth does not require us to deny historical plausibility. It shows why iconography matters. At the same time, the conversation teaches epistemic humility. The further we push beyond what the evidence allows, the more careful we must be with language.
Probable conclusions about appearance differ from confessions about identity, and both differ from theological claims about the person and work of Jesus. Our debate about skin tone should never obscure central Christian claims about incarnation, redemption, and resurrection. Nor should it become a tool to denigrate those who have loved and been sustained by particular artistic traditions. There are practical consequences. Churches and educators can broaden the range of images they use, so worshipers of diverse backgrounds see themselves reflected in sacred art. Historians and artists can collaborate with scholars in anthropology and archaeology to present reconstructions rooted in regional data, while clearly explaining their limits. Theologians and pastors can affirm the pastoral legitimacy of images that foster dignity and solidarity for marginalized communities, while also teaching the historical context that prevents reductive claims. In the end, the question, "Was Jesus really a black man?" pushes us towards a more mature understanding. Historically, Jesus was most likely a Middle Eastern Jew whose appearance resembled people of that region. Describing him with modern racial labels can obscure that reality. Yet darker depictions of Christ are both defensible within the broader historical and geographical frame, and deeply meaningful for communities who have used the image to claim justice and belonging. If this unpacking changed your perspective, like and share this video, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how images of Jesus have shaped your faith. Check the description for sources and suggested reading, including works by Reza Aslan on historical Jesus debates, James Cone on Black liberation theology, and summaries of forensic reconstructions and art history scholarship. Above all, may this conversation push us towards humility, historical honesty, and deeper solidarity with one another in the ways we imagine the face of God.